Anyone watching this channel is undoubtedly familiar with the Captain Morgan brand of rum. The mascot of the brand is so iconic that I don't think the rum would have been so popular without Captain Morgan himself. He is obviously based on the real-world Sir Henry Morgan, who you might recognize from last month's biography episode. And despite being a very important historical figure, a lot of people probably know him only through the iconic mascot. The legacy of the real man is shaped by a fictionalized rum mascot. I therefore found it interesting to seek out and have a discussion with the artist who designed Captain Morgan, for him to explain the story behind the mascot and the rum, how he was inspired by history and piracy to design the mascot, and also how he feels about his own impact on the legacy of Henry Morgan and pirates as a whole. Meet Don Maitz, a Connecticut-born painter of pirates, novels, fantasy and science fiction. But it is better if I let him introduce himself.
My name is
And
Don
everything.
Maitz. I am an artist illustrator. I graduated from an art school way back when Moby Dick was a winnow, and I've been working ever since. My actual portfolio pieces were accepted by publishers, so I've been published even, out of art school. Otherwise, I've done lots of different illustrating. I've done fantasy novels, horror novels, historical novels, science fiction, and some advertising,
Wow.
including, the fellow behind me.
Have you done any writing yourself since you talked a bit about, your wife? She's been involved in that.
Actually, no. And the world is better for it. I, I- Spell checking is my friend. Uh, Most of my storytelling is very visual. When I
Right,
was a youngster, I was heavily into comic books, and that
right.
whole sequential imaging was how I took in words. Words and pictures, blended together for me at an early age, and some of my earliest work was actually published in a couple of comics.
Mm,
I had some drawings in Marvel. They were advertising type, single figure things, not stories.
yeah.
I was in art school while I was being groomed to be in the comics, and I decided to stay in art school because I liked painting, and although I liked the covers of comics, the whole sequential thing, I liked reading it and watching how it was done, but I really much rather do a single image that encapsulates the book than go
Mm.
through all the, word by word and do an image for every action.
What I like to point out is that you can definitely see the comic book influence in a lot of your art, I think. Like, for example, you sent me a couple of days ago the letter to Panama,
Hmm.
inspired by the Cossack painting. You can see the sort of comic book influence there. Like, all of the characters are very animated, they're doing stuff. And
Hmm.
also how you work with colors, you have very colorful art, everything stands out, it's very stylized. Would you say that is like those elements are comic book influence on you?
I think the hard edge outlines are the comic influence
Yeah,
because I'm heavily into drawing. Every
yeah.
painting I've done, I've started with a sound drawing underneath, and I've blurred edges and things. But that the comic books taught me how to draw.
And it's interesting to me as well because me as well. I grew up reading a lot of comic books and stuff like that, like Donald Duck, and I also used to when I was a kid, I had a hobby of drawing comics myself. So it is interesting. But would you say that like the art school were they opposed or were they very friendly towards this style, bringing in this influence of comic books and that sort of
I
inspiration?
was sort of an odd mix in this art school. I mean,
Right.
the school was very focused on still life painting and traditional fine art painting, and they had some illustration, but the comics and fantasy painting and that were not really well known there.
Mm.
Um, we took a school trip to the Brandywine River Museum where I got to see Howard Pyle and N.C. Wyeth
Oh wow.
illustrations, and
Yeah.
that was a real extension of the comic book shocked to me,
Yeah.
saying, "Wow, these are painted adventure scenes, very much like what, comics were doing. Some of my earlier comics were very adventurous kind of comics, Turek fighting, dinosaurs and Magnum fighting robots and things, and these were images that I was able to translate from comics to, the golden age of illustration. There was an artist who there was an exhibition at the Yale University Art Gallery when I was a student, and his name was Edwin Austin Abbey. Abbey painted a lot of Shakespearean paint stories.
Mm.
And I saw some of these that he did on the wall, and they were just spectacular. They were jaw-dropping. I said, okay, comics are okay, but this is totally amazing. I'm not a big Shakespeare fan, but those paintings I was a big fan of. They were just absolutely incredibly done. So that was an inspiration to keep me in art school and keep me painting as opposed to going into comics. And at the time, comics were there was a big to do with the ownership of the artwork,
Mm.
and the comic book companies wanted to keep all the art, and the artists were just getting sort of pay wage, and not being able to keep their own painting, their own drawings, and also, when you're working for a comic, you're part of a company, and so you do the
Mm.
pencils, somebody else would put the ink on it, somebody else would do the lettering, someone else would put the color on it, and so you're really not claiming the entire product. It's just
Mm.
you're a peacetime, piecemeal worker.
A lot of people that are watching, a lot of them are artists themselves. There are a lot of great artists in the community,
Hmm.
so they're definitely going to love to hear this story. And a lot of them are also inspired by, they're going to recognize the name Howard Pyle and NC Wyeth.
Sure.
A lot of their art, I also used them in a lot of the videos. It's very very iconic and has been quite influential.
Yeah.
Um,
Where I grew up was Plainville, Connecticut. I mean, and if you can
mhm.
imagine a ville that was plain, this was it, okay? And but
Yeah,
the next town over was New Britain, and they had a
right.
lot of industry there, Stanley Tools and things, and they had a little private art museum called the New Britain Museum of American Art, and one of their directors was Stanford Lowe, and he collected illustration and set up a illustration um, uh, section of the museum, and he got a hold of the N.C. Wyeth painting from Treasure Island, One More Step, Mr. Hands, with Hawkins up in the
Oh yeah,
rigging, and he's painting
yeah, yeah.
has the two pistols down at Israel Hands, and that's a great big painting, and it's full of a lot of gusto and brushstrokes and things. And I used to just sit in front of that thing and admire, what he was able to accomplish. And I mean, the painting is even bigger than my Captain Morgan behind me.
Oh wow, yeah.
NC painted huge, 30 by 40 at least.
Speaking of which, so of course most of the interview is going to concern your work with the bottle, so to speak,
Hmm.
and your design of the Captain Morgan character. Um, so what is the story behind the mascot? So did you design him independently, or did you do it on
No,
commission?
at
What
the
how did
time,
it go?
not long after I graduated art school, I was
Right.
working in New York, but Ken Davies recommended that I find myself an agent, and so
Hmm.
I looked in New York and found myself an artist representative that I was with for, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, and he was contacted by Joseph Seagram's and Sons. They were trying to release a new liquor product, and they looked at my portfolio, and I guess I had enough licks that looked similar to NC Wyeth, Howard Pyle kind of thing. So they said, "Well, we're doing a Captain Morgan spiced rum product, and we'd like you to do some sketches to see if we would hire you to do the label." And back then, a lot of products were being released, and most of them pretty much failed. So it
Mm.
was my agent didn't think it was a big deal that this was coming along, but I got the job, and in December, I was required to do 3 color sketches and bring them into New York on January 2nd. So all through the winter holidays and after New Year's, I was working on the Captain Morgan um, assignment, and I'm doing this in Connecticut. And when I started my career, I had a very inexpensive third floor attic apartment. And it was cold and it was hot and it was
Yeah.
inconvenient, but it was cheap. And I was working up there and finishing these three 8 by 10 oil sketches. And that really wasn't very smart, And since then, I've only done acrylic sketches because they dry much quicker. Oils are, take a bit longer, particularly in Connecticut in the wintertime because it's cold and damp, and oils dry better in warm and hot and
Right.
dry. So I have these three wet oil sketches, and I need to protect them because I'm going into New York where it's even cold and damp again, and I don't want them to smudge. So I wanted to put mats on them to keep to keep the keep them from smudging. And the matting equipment was in my parents' basement a couple of miles away. So I had to take the sketches over there, cut the mats, and bring them back, and then pack everything up for the next day. And it had snowed, and so I had to clean off the car and scrape the windows and all the stuff you got to do when it snows. And so I got that all done, and I got in the car and I went to my parents' house. And um, I got there and I realized that the sketches weren't with me. And then I recalled I left them on the roof of the car. And so I'm, thinking to myself, my career is over. I will never get another job. My agent's going to fire me. Seagrams isn't going to like me. I'll never work in this town again. And so I'm blubbering, looking on either side of the road for where my sketches may have fallen off the car. And in the wintertime in Connecticut, they sand and salt the roads. So it was pretty gritty and nasty and slushy. And so I'm looking all over, and finally, I was near my where my apartment was, and there's a McDonald's on the corner. And I turn the corner, and there are my sketches in the middle of the road, and cars are running over them. Two of them are face down in the grit, and one of them's face up with tire tracks on them. And so I'm, like stopping traffic, picking up my poor little damaged paintings and blubbering all over them, and trying to pick the salt and the sand off of them. And so I, go back to my parents' house and I cut the mats for them. And then I go back to my studio apartment and I try to clean these things up so I can deliver them the next day in New York. So I was up all night, trying to fill in the holes where the sand had divoted the paintings and then covering it over and dripping over wet paint. So it was all night long doing this. And so I got on the train without any sleep, went into New York and got in front of, the board of directors of Joseph Seagram's. And they're looking over my sketches. And I'm thinking to myself, they have no idea that this was roadkill. They decided to pick the pose from one sketch, the costume from another sketch, and the background from the third sketch. So it was good that I didn't just fix one of them. I used all three of them.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
but it was hair raising to say the least, to get the work.
But it definitely sounds like one of these crossroads moments, where you can go back in time and look like, oh, if this had gone slightly different, the whole, future might have changed, you might have had like a different career, like you said, your agent might have fired you, or,
Hmm.
maybe they wouldn't have had a mascot, and, would they have been able to, sell as well as they do? Because I'm thinking that like one of the reasons why the Captain Morgan spiced rum might have been so successful as it has been is because it has such an iconic mascot.
I
Um,
think so. I don't know if you can help me, but I was in England just as I was doing this, and there was a Henry Morgan rum that was being sold in England, and I couldn't
really?
figure out too much about it because in England they at the bars the bottles are upside down, and they
Ah,
they put them on
yeah,
stoppers, and then
yeah.
they have a spigot at the bottom. And so I'm looking, I'm trying to turn my head to see, what this thing looked like, but it was a rendition of Henry Morgan, on a bottle. It looked, what I did was Captain Morgan original spiced rum, and that was the hook. They had vanilla and other spices in it, and so that was the selling point for the rum product. Was it was a spiced rum, and that was their come along for the new product. So Um, I don't know if they even knew that there was another rum in England that was, non-spice that was. I have no idea. This is was above my pay grade. This is what, Joseph and Sons was Joseph Seagram's. And
Right.
while I was doing this product, I did numerous advertising campaigns. I did six of them all told, and I was with the product for like 20 years. I started it in 1982, and in 2005, Diageo uh, purchased the product from Seagram's sons. They Joseph had passed away, and the sons were looking to retool their product line and decided they would sell off the Captain Morgan and continue with their other products. And so when Diageo bought the Captain Morgan product, they wanted to keep the iconic symbol of Captain Morgan, but they wanted it to look different. So that's when they hired another artist, a contemporary of mine, Greg Manchess, to do another version of the Captain Morgan,
Mm.
and it was slightly different. It didn't have all the spices all around his feet, and the rum barrel was different. It, it was another version of what I did. So he copied it, but differently. And I guess recently they changed the label one more time. So Diageo is doing what they can with the product. But when I left the product, or when the product left me, it was the second largest selling rum in the world worldwide. So it got pretty popular under my watch. It's a wonderful advertising tool for me. Okay. I mean, I can say I'm the guy that did this. And because,
Yeah.
I retain my rights, I can do that. I mean, I can sell the original painting. I can stand next to it in front of, God and everybody and say, I painted this. And that's a big tickle because, the rum company originally put a lot of investment in getting their product to sell, and so it was on billboards, it was in magazines, it was in the stores, in the liquor stores, it was everywhere. And I can't get that kind of advertising for my artwork just by going up to somebody and say, hey, I'm an artist, make me famous. I mean, this rum product did a lot to put my name in the marketplace. I've done a lot of other things. I've illustrated Stephen King. I've done
Yeah.
National Geographic work. I've been on the History Channel, but this iconic character has carried me through a lot because name recognition, by virtue of, I mean, a lot of people drink rum,
I'm
and
one of them. I'm one of
yeah.
them.
Well, what I found, I mean, I was reading a book by the fellow who discovered the Whydah. I don't know if you're familiar with Barry Clifford, but
Yeah, yeah, yep.
he discovered the only actual pirate ship. And while they were searching for the sunken ship off of Cape Cod, they were trying to appease the pirate gods by pouring Captain Morgan into the ocean, to be able to help them find their missing shipwreck. And so it's become associated with pirates, like it or not. Um, and so I mean, it's brought me interesting places. I went to a lot of pirate festivals, and I
Yeah.
have name recognition because I did the rum everybody's drinking. But it allowed me to photograph people that were designing their own historical costumes. It gave me
Oh
a
yeah.
door in to museum exhibitions. I mean, Florida is a great big place where they sell Captain Morgan. I mean, his fiberglass statue is all over the place. And I've had numerous exhibitions of my pirate art all over Florida by virtue of, using, the name recognition there. So he's opened a lot of doors for me. There's a couple of stories I could tell. One was
Mhm.
doing the ad campaign that is over here.
Yeah.
Um, what happens is Seagram's hires an ad agency, and the ad agency hires an illustrator. And this ad agency was new to the Seagram's company, and they contacted me saying, we're not sure, you're the artist that did Captain Morgan. We need you to do some drawings to prove to us you can actually do the captain for us. And so I did a bunch of drawings, and they said, okay, yeah, you can do this. And so I did the paintings, and I started with one painting, and it wasn't this one. This was sort of the last one, but the first one, they were all uptight because it was a new client for them, and they go, "Oh no, we want his eyebrows a little different. We want his hair brown. And can you put braids in his hair on over here and make him look mischievous, and I'm getting all this art direction, and so I'm trying to move his eyebrows around and figure out his hair and make him brown haired and doing everything they told me because that's what they're telling me. And it was kind of funny because they're all worried. They bring my painting into the before they were able to bring the painting in. I sent it FedEx, the original
Mm.
art, and it didn't arrive. And the ad agency is getting all over me, going, "Well, where is it? Where is it?" And I says, "Well, contact FedEx. I mean, here's a tracking number. And I'm calling FedEx. They're calling FedEx, and FedEx is really quiet. They're not answering where this package went. And then finally, it was delivered, and I called FedEx, and what was going on with this thing? And they said, "Well, one of our drivers got really sick and he checked himself into the hospital and he left the truck on the side of the road and he didn't tell us where the truck was, and my painting was in this truck." So they're literally all over the streets in New York looking for the FedEx truck that had my Captain Morgan painting in it. And anyway, so what happened was they showed him this painting with the mischievous eyebrows and the brown hair,
Yeah.
and the Seagrams, Joseph Seagrams and Sons, and the art director said, "No, this isn't right." And they pulled out one of my previous paintings and said, "We want this." And so they left me alone, and I was able to do this painting for them and redid the other one. So it
All right.
was, it's. I really don't like working advertising very much because there's a
Yeah.
lot of that it's hurry up, do it yesterday, and do it our way or else.
You said they sort of like directed you a bit, like they wanted the eyebrows different, the hair color different. Is that something you like or dislike, like having very direct orders, like wishes from the commissioner? Or do you like
Uh,
to do stuff entirely by yourself?
when they make sense, I'm happy to do it. But if it really goes against my better judgment, then I tend to fight for it a bit. And I actually did that one time with National Geographic. It was a very intense painting, and they how do I explain this? You know anything about copyright, okay? Artists, when they create
Yeah.
something,
Yeah.
they own the copyright to it, and they
Yeah, of
keep
course.
that copyright or register it unless they sign those rights away. And a lot of artists are faced with a decision whether, do I retain the ownership of this work of art or do I sell it? Okay. And, you have to think, am I getting paid enough to lose all interest in this image? And I was working for National Geographic Kids World magazine, and I did paintings of the widow. I did
Mm.
Captain Kidd. I did Blackbeard and all this for this Kids World magazine back then. It's called
Wow.
World now. But so I did all these illustrations, and they had no problem with me keeping ownership of the rights. They would buy the rights to put it in the magazine, and I would be able to retain other rights. So I'm working now for National Geographic magazine, and I'm assuming that it's National Geographic. The deal is the same. I'd be able to, they buy it for their magazine, and I retain the other rights. And I kept saying to the art director, "Send me your contract. Send me your contract." Meanwhile, I'm painting this thing, and I looked at the contract and said, "They want all rights to this thing." And I go, that wasn't what I agreed with before. And so I went to him, and he said, "Well, we're National Geographic. This is what we do. And I go, and so I said, "Oh," and I talked to my wife saying, "Look at, I don't want to give up my rights on this." But, because
Yeah.
there was money involved, I wanted to make sure that the household would, and she says, "Do what was right." I mean, she knows all about copyright. And so I said to the art director, "Well, give me the kill fee." and you don't get the image. He goes, but it's in schedule. We're National Geographic. No, you don't get it. Give me the kill fee. And so they rewrote the contract so that I would be able to do other things with the image and keep the rights, but I would have to let them know when I did something with it to make sure it didn't conflict with their interests. When you sell all rights, you sell all the rights to reproduce the image. You
Yeah.
generally get to keep the original art unless you sign a work for hire agreement. Work for hire means you lose own authorship. Another, it's like Mickey Mouse. Nobody knows who did Mickey Mouse. Okay, the guy that drew Mickey Mouse
Mm.
gave up his authorship. He can't say he did it. Okay, when you sell all rights, you sell all reproduction rights. You keep your authorship. Okay, so I can, sit next to this Captain Morgan image here and say I did it because I didn't
Yeah.
sign the work for hire agreement that they wanted me to sign when they sent it to me. And my agent said, "Here, sign it in blood." And I go, "No, I'm not going to sign this." And they pressured me to be able to sign it. And I said, "No, I just won't. I won't sign a work for hire agreement."
Yeah.
To artists out there,
Yeah.
you want to be very careful what you sign. If you sign anything that says exclusive, if you sign anything that says all rights, if you sign anything that has work for hire in the language, be very, very careful. Try to negotiate out of it. Try to put a time limit on it. If you have to sell all rights, sell it for a limited time. If you're having to do a work for hire, see what you can get out of the work for hire. Negotiate, because once you set it in motion, you can't stop it. You signed it, and they get it. And more companies want to own everything, and don't let them. I mean, your copyright is like a great big piece of pie, and you want to sell little tiny slices of it. You don't want to give them the whole pie. And negotiate your way so that you're able to make prints of this stuff, sell it later, have secondary rights, be very, one time, and limit usually you can't limit the geography now because everything is internet and it's world rights, but
Hmm.
limit them to one time world rights reproduction to a specific title, so that you're limiting what they can use your image for so that you can use it for other things later.
I think it's a very good message out there as well, especially since, a lot of, like I said, there are a lot of artists in the community, and a lot of artists, I think, are going to watch this. Copyright, is probably going to enter, well, it is like entering a new sort of era now as well, with AI, where
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
copying a lot of art and using it, and the lawmakers are still trying to figure that out.
One thing about, AI that, is distressing to a lot of artists. And,
Hmm.
I mean, I started drawing when I was a kid, just like you did, doing little cartoons.
Yeah.
And I kept at it and I put hours into it, and then, as I said before, I studied uh, different artists. And then I studied the universities where I can get an education. And then I went into an art school, and I was drawing like every day, 5 days a week. We used to do 18-hour one figure drawing in a week, 3 days on one drawing for
Yeah.
18 hours just to study the human figure. I've got a drawer full of figure drawings that I did just to hone my skills, plus all the failed paintings that I've done,
Yeah.
And you get this guy who's a typist going in there and plugging in a few keystrokes and coming up with, all this stolen imagery off of the internet that people have spent lifetimes trying to hone their skills. And it really is disgusting and to
Yeah.
me that someone is getting a quick ego fix thinking they're an artist, and they have no clue what actually goes in it. And so I really, and what bothers me is that artificial intelligence can have so many wonderful uses. it can
Mm.
be it can be an astounding research tool to help people to do the kind of backbreaking labor to get information, and they could assemble it for them. It's wonderful. But instead, what do? They go for the low hanging fruit, and they go for, imaging, that is going to take jobs away from artists, and it's going to
Yeah.
cheapen, the work that has been done for centuries in our in the art community, and all the Renaissance masters and all this. I mean, there's a thing called public domain
Yep.
where
Yep.
and I would say, if you're going to use AI, go into public domain and use that, but don't go after, your favorite artist and take his licks away and then make paintings that are sort of bad renditions of your favorite artist. I mean, it's rude. Um, there's a very popular fantasy artist named Frank Frazetta. You may or may not have heard of him, but he gave Arnold Schwarzenegger a career, because he did
Okay.
the
Oh yeah,
Conan character,
Conan the Barbarian. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, Conan the Barbarian and all that. Well, he was very popular, and he was a big influence for me too. And one of my
wow,
early cover paintings, he did me a wonderful favor. I went and visited his museum early on, when it was back in East Stroudsburg, and I met his wife, and she was looking at my artwork, and I did a John Carter of Mars game board cover box, and it wasn't a copy of Frank Frazetta's painting, but I was emulating his style like you can't believe.
yeah,
And he said, "Oh, you're Don Maitz," and he gave me this stink eye, saying, "I saw that John Carter painting you did," you know, and it just struck me, saying, he didn't really appreciate, me emulating what he does, and
yeah,
so it was like, okay, I got to do my own thing and not, be a slave to someone else's image. Even though I love his work, it's hands off. That's his stuff, you know. And so many artists don't do that. And if you're gonna copy another artist, if you look at Renaissance masters, you have Peter Paul Rubens, and he would say, he would do a Da Vinci painting. He would say Rubens after Da Vinci, and he would credit the artist that inspired the work that he did, because he was
yeah,
emulating them. And AI doesn't do that, and a lot of
no,
these artists don't. They just say, "Oh, it's art, it's mine. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to do, I'm Let me talk a little bit about Captain Morgan.
yeah,
I'm somewhat embarrassed by the image that I did, because Henry Morgan lived in the 1600s,
yeah,
and the art directors and Joseph Seagrams decided they wanted him to look like a classical pirate to their imagination, not to what he actually looked like. So his costume is more Georgian, more 18th century than 17th century, and that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But they wanted to sell their rum. They really didn't want an accurate rendition of Henry Morgan. One of my preliminary sketches, I thought, was a really good rendition of what I thought Henry Morgan would look like, and it was the sketch that had his foot up on the rum barrel, and he had a glass of a mug of rum in his hand, and I thought Henry Morgan would have looked sort of like that. But we ended up with the red suit. And the interesting thing about the Captain Morgan image that's there, he's wearing a red coat with yellow
mhm,
trim with a blue cape. And artists would know that that's the primary color scheme.
mhm,
Okay.
yeah,
Red, yellow, and blue are primary colors. Purple, orange, and green are secondary colors. And what I found that was really interesting is I saw an article in Wired magazine, and they tested. They gathered all the superhero costumes and the supervillain costumes and color coded them, and all the superheroes are wearing primary colors, and all the villains are wearing secondary colors. So
mhm,
one of the things that makes Captain Morgan heroic is that he's wearing the primary colors, that go with the superheroes, if you will. And that was one of the decisions that was made, by the advertising agency. Um, the other thing that's kind of interesting is that I became a medical marvel by virtue of painting this Captain Morgan character.
yeah,
And that was because some medical professor was drinking Captain Morgan rum and looking at the bottle, and he said to himself, you know, this could really work in the emergency rooms. When a patient comes in with a dislocated hip, the procedure was to get on top of the gurney and grab the person's leg and force the femur into the pelvic area to get that injury um, resettled into where it belongs. And he looked at the Captain Morgan and said, you know, if they assume the Captain Morgan pose, we can lever the femur into there without having to get up on the gurney. So now it's become a medical procedure in emergency rooms. So, you know,
And you
how
don't
about
have to
that?
amputate and install a wooden leg either. So,
Well, that's true. Yes, absolutely. Well, you can do that, and in some cases it's warranted.
sorry, I'm
Um,
curious, where did you actually get the idea of the pose from?
it was, I thought to myself, in those, sketches that became roadkill, I was thinking about, okay, here's Henry Morgan, they're selling rum. I'm going to put a rum barrel and have him put his foot on it, saying, "This is my rum." It's, putting his foot down on and claiming the product. So it was just,
Yeah.
a gesture that I thought was a possessive gesture for, someone who's creating rum. And Henry Morgan was a sugarcane land, plantation owner. And so, he came rightly by, sugarcane and making rum, and he drank like a fish in his in his
Oh,
in
yes.
his early years. So, um, the idea of him, claiming a rum barrel was
It's quite
was right there.
appropriate.
Yes, absolutely. But I felt guilty about, him not being representative to being Henry Morgan. So that's when I started doing my own pirate art,
Ah,
sort of as
okay.
a compensation for it. And, one of the reasons I moved to Florida was that I'm able to be close to the stomping grounds of these pirates. Actually, I did two illustrations initially. One was a
Yeah.
pen and ink that was used on the initial label. And the second was the painting that's behind me. And they used the
Mhm.
colors of the painting to colorize the pen and ink for the rum label. Um, that they did. They did a four-color process over the ink lines so that it would stand out. On the when the bottles are in the liquor store, they wanted them to stand out, so they wanted a hard white black outline with
Yeah.
colors. So the painting behind me was their coloration map for doing the rum label, and I gave him the cape to make him more I figured he's a swashbuckling pirate, so I tried to make him look as swashbuckling as I possibly could with the cape flowing in the wind. You'll notice his head is kind of small for his figure, and that's something I learned from comics, where if you want to make someone look massive, you reduce the size of the head a little bit, and it makes them look taller. More head sizes for the body size gives him
Yeah.
a more massive appearance. And the idea of him putting his hand on a sword gives him a dashing appearance. And I really didn't use a model for him. He pretty much came out of my imagination. And
Okay.
again, I saw what Howard Pyle did with Henry Morgan, and he was all the renditions I saw. He was a little bit pudgy, and I would think that if this guy's like crawling all over the Caribbean, and raiding cities and things, he would have a little bit more dash to him than the drawings that I was seeing in history books.
Yeah, and also if you look at I think there are two images of him from the period. One is I don't know if you've seen it. There's like a painting that's now hanging at Tredegar in Wales, which is supposed to be a painting of him as a teenager.
Mm,
And then there's the Exquemelin woodcut, where he
yes.
does look a bit pudgy, like you say. And of course, in his late age, when he was retired and everything, he had dropsy. He was on the bottle, like you said
Hmm.
before. He was a bit fat, but in his heyday, in his prime, he was probably a bit more swashbuckling looking.
Yes.
No, that's a very interesting thing as well, because obviously you are very well versed in history and very well read. Uh, were you this invested in history and in pirates before you designed the Captain Morgan mascot?
Actually, I did them before. When I was in art school, I did a painting of Vikings, and my
Oh
very
yeah.
first fantasy book cover where I got a manuscript. It was because Frank Frazetta was too busy and he turned down the job, and I happened to
Mhm.
be in the right place at the right time and received a manuscript, and it was about monkey pirates, if you will. Chimpanzees and monkeys were fighting pirates, and so my first actual book cover was of a pirate ship being boarded by chimpanzees, and a fight between pirates and a Cornell-educated man ape. So, I was doing it in one fashion or another ahead of Captain Morgan. But once I did Captain Morgan, it was like, well, I've got all these billboards and it's in magazines and it's everywhere, and his costume isn't right. So let me show you what I can really do using history as a guide rather than an advertising campaign. One of the ad campaigns that they had me do wanted to sell coconut rum, and the
Right.
advertising agent wanted me to have the coconuts like growing out of the palm fronds, like ornaments on a tree. And I'm going, they
Right.
don't do that. And he goes, well, they can, and I'm going, no, they don't. And so, I ended up doing, like I said, okay, what I'll do is a flying coconut as if it hit the ground and bounced back up. Okay, so they could get the
Ah,
coconut.
yeah.
I mean, you're dealing with, people that, want to sell something, and
Right.
they don't
Right.
really have their head in reality sometimes. In fact, this painting here has Captain Morgan with his sword out,
Yeah.
and in the advertising, I added a coconut, and Henry
Uh-huh.
Morgan is such a fellow. He's slicing through the coconut, with a swing of his. Have you ever tried to open up a coconut? My God, I was, I bought a coconut and I was there for a half an hour with a hacksaw trying to get into this thing. But Henry Morgan, he just, flicks his sword and, into the coconut he goes. But so it's all for smoke and mirrors for advertising, and that's what we uh, that's what we get when we have a product they're
Right.
trying to sell.
Do you think that you have somehow, by creating this very iconic mascot that is obviously, based on the real world, Henry Morgan, do you think you have shaped his legacy in some way and how people perceive him, Henry Morgan, the privateer?
I think that that is true, and I have done that. Um, I would just like people to read about him, you know, by virtue of saying, "Ooh, Henry Morgan, I've seen his picture on a rum bottle. Let me find out more about him."
Yeah.
When the ad agency, um, I mean, there were people in the ad agency that didn't know he was an actual person that lived in history, that did historical events. They just thought, he was like, Jose Gaspar or somebody, Captain Kidd. He had, I mean, everybody thinks, sees a pirate and they go R, and they don't really understand anything about it,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, Captain Morgan fits into that slot a little bit in that he's so iconic that people look at him and they go R, and they don't
Yeah.
get that it's not just Captain Morgan, it's Sir Henry Morgan, and anything about him, it's just like, I'm gonna get some rum, and I want that guy's rum.
Speaking of which, about the real world Henry Morgan, since you obviously, you're very well read and you have read about him, how do you feel about Henry Morgan as a person, about his history, his career, his life, about him as a person?
Well, all I could know about him is through the reading that I've done. Um, and Peter Earle explained him pretty well, saying he was a master at organizing disparate forces and creating an army out of unlikely characters. In other words, he's dealing with like Marines centuries before the Marines were actually invented. He
Right.
had
Yeah.
land and sea forces. He had and he was incredibly lucky. My God, to be on a ship where the magazine blows up and be at the end of the table that blew him out the window and he survived. I mean, what a what a character. I mean, what a fellow he was. Um, so and the fact that he was clever, and he was insidious. I mean he did horrible things, to people, to extract gold. um, but by the same token, during the same time period, the Spanish weren't very nice either. What they did to Native American peoples, and what they did to their own people themselves. I mean, everyone in that time period didn't really have clean hands, so to speak. Um, but the fact that, Henry Morgan was very, very clever. I mean, uh, he used the peace treaties to his advantage. He'd find out that we're about to go to peace with Spain, so he would get the heck out of Jamaica before the orders came in, and so he would do his raids, and going, whoops, I didn't know we were at peace. So he was just, shading the lines of being legitimate, so to speak. I mean, he was a privateer. He was hired by the Jamaican governor to go after cities in the Spanish that could attack Jamaica. That was his prerequisite. So he just said, well, they were building ships against us, and I burned them. So, and nobody could prove it. I mean, and also at the time period, it took weeks for any messages to go across the Atlantic, to go back and forth. So he took advantage of that. So he was just a very astute, clever person that used every advantage he could, and he ended up a landowner, and got him, drank himself silly every night. So he was a very successful, one of the most successful pirates, because he came out getting knighted, and lieutenant governor of Jamaica, and he actually hunted pirates down later in his career. So he was a rich and storied life he led. You were talking about Port Royal, and
Yeah.
it was the most decadent and richest city in the Western Hemisphere during the age of the Buccaneers, because they were raiding so many Spanish ships, and in the time of Henry Morgan, they brought so much riches into the city, and they spent it just incredibly fast. I mean, pirates
Yeah.
were rich one day and poor the next. And I have this saying that I tell people, and that is, the legend of Robin Hood. Robin Hood's merry men stole from the rich and gave to the poor. And I'd say, well, pirate captains and their jolly companions stole from the rich and gave to the whore. One of the interesting things about Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island was he really
Yep.
depicted, the pirates so well. They were,
Yeah.
he described them in vivid detail on, their attitudes and their lifestyles, and it was Long John Silver just trying to keep them in line, because they were just, loose cannons, literally.
No, and it's definitely, if you compare it to a lot of other books, Treasure Island is it's a very dark one. It's a gritty one, despite being considered, a kid's book by today's
Hmm.
standards. I don't think it could be published as a book for kids. Definitely not.
Probably not. No. But every kid is well aware of it. It's a terrific
Oh,
book.
definitely. Oh, I loved it as a kid, and I'm sure a lot of other people felt the same.
I don't know. I mean, you've probably seen it, but the film Treasure Island, that had Charlton Heston and Robert Louis Stevenson,
Yeah, yeah, it's my
is
favorite.
is long done. Yeah, mine too. And I noticed that a lot of the cinematography was trying to emulate the illustrations in NCY's Treasure Island book. I don't know if you noticed that, but some of
No,
the coloration and the scenes were definitely inspired by the paintings in that book.
have you worked anything else with the rum company? It's Diego now, isn't it?
Yes, uh,
What is your relationship
Diageo
with
is the
them
name of the
nowadays?
the company, and no, I
Yeah,
haven't done anything since. You know, the, a a new owner sweeps with a clean broom. So
right.
what they want to do is make sure that they had no connection to the the previous owner of the Captain Morgan product. I mean,
Mm,
a lot of people just didn't know that it even changed ownership. All they
no.
saw was a new label, but that was their intent was to make sure that it's our product now and we want to put our stamp on it. There's very little I have in contact with them. They're in England and I'm not really associated with the product anymore. And thank God they don't come after me for doing videos like this. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
any publicity is good publicity.
And I think it's quite appropriate, because to a lot of people, the pirate, it symbolizes freedom, and independence. So it's quite appropriate and a great thing that you have a lot of independence and freedom when it comes to the character you've designed. You can do a lot with it, and you can continue to profit from it, and indirectly, and directly. That's I think that's a really good thing. And for a lot of artists, I think also that's probably quite inspiring.
Hmm.
Um, but I'm thinking, since you have this great historical interest, let's say if you had full control over the mascot, would you redesign him in any way? Would you change him, or would you keep him as he is?
I would have put him in more period appropriate clothing and try to add the swashbuckling attitude to a costume that would be more conducive to what Henry Morgan would have actually worn. That would have made me happier, but this is, again, I like to follow history when I can. I hate
Right.
people looking at my painting and going, "That's not Henry Morgan. He wouldn't have worn that." And I know it, and I can't really change it because, do I sell the product and appease the client, or do I appease my own idiosyncrasies about, the character that is named after?
Of course, they changed the character a lot from the more historical inspiration into one that's draws some influence from superheroes and stuff like that, and the traditional stereotypical swashbuckler. And it's also something you see in a lot of movies and video games and stuff where the artists and the directors, they are afraid to go for the more historical route because they want something which people can recognize, because they are afraid otherwise people won't be able to connect with it, so to speak. But do you think it is possible that for like branding and for this like popular media, that it's possible to marry it with the historical influence, that these two elements can go together and create something which can appeal to a lot of people, that people can understand, etc.?
Well, I mean, look at the popularity of, Captain Jack Sparrow. I mean, he
Mm,
was, Disney does generally a pretty good job of historical accuracy within costumes, as well as, Monty Python. My God, there's a historical accuracy going on in there that still, creates transcend characters that really come alive. Um,
right.
and so I think that, it's quite possible to be historically accurate and also be, solve the problem of public acceptance.
And of course, you after the Captain Morgan, you have continued to illustrate, to draw, to paint pirates. What inspires you to keep going with pirates, to keep drawing them? What is drawing you in?
Well, what had happened was that I had done a number of pirate, for National Geographic, and
Hmm.
I also moved from Connecticut to Florida, and one of the reasons I moved here was that this was, close to the pirate stomping grounds. I mean, I've gone to Key West numerous times, and that's as far into the Caribbean as I can get with a car. Um, and so I'm able to, see sea grapes and sea oats and the actual environment that pirates could have inhabited. And that gives me inspiration to be able to do a more historically accurate situation with pirates. So one of the reasons I moved down here was to create an environment around pirates that would be something like a lot of illustrators had moved out west to paint Indians and cowboys and Western art. and several of them, Howard Turpinning and James Bama became very famous for, their renditions of, and Frank McCarthy for, the whole cowboy genre and the Native American characters and landscapes and the great out west during the time of the Great Expansion. And I thought, the Great Expansion happened when, Europe left and came to the New World. And so
Right.
being able to show that time period and being in an environment that was close to, where these people were going and landing and doing their trade would make for an interesting collection of artwork. I mean, there's Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates, and that's the only real big collection of that kind of artwork that had been done. Other artists have
Right.
done that since with children's books and things like that. But I've created, uh, a lot of paintings based on the age of piracy. And one of my paintings that I did for there was a crazy guy who just recently passed away. His name was Horatio Sinbad, and he lived in the around Beaufort, Massachusetts, right near where they discovered Queen Anne's Revenge, a
Mm.
Blackbeard ship. And the museum that was the Queen Anne's Revenge archaeological site was right in his backyard. And I did a painting of him as a pirate, and friends of mine that I met through these pirate festivals ended up posing for it, and the painting ended up being hanging in the Pentagon a couple of summers
Wow.
ago with a bunch of. I belong to the American Society of Marine Artists, and they have them in
That's amazing.
England and various other countries, but I'm a member of the American Society, and they had a relationship with the Navy, and they did a War of 1812 documentary using paintings from members in the association that have done historical paintings of the War of 1812. And they used one of
Yeah.
my pirate paintings because of privateers in the 1812. And so,
Right.
I've been involved in, a documentary for the Navy, and this thing at the Pentagon was another. We're about to have a quatricentennial. I'm really good with words. Quin- Quincentennial, where it's a 200-year anniversary of the founding
Right.
in the United States, and they wanted to have an exhibition of defending America's shores, and so one of my paintings ended up in that exhibition at the Pentagon. So it's weird, I joined this American Society of Marine Artists to try to give legitimacy to pirates, and
Yeah.
it's sort of working.
This is related to what you were just talking about, but you were also talking about previously the Wild West and drawing a sort of connection between the Wild West and the Caribbean pirates and the colonization there. As an American, do you sort of see the sort of Caribbean colonization and the golden age of pirates as a sort of pre-Wild West period? Like, do you think it's
Absolutely.
is like it's has the same sort of foundational
Sure.
impact?
It's an age of expansion. I mean, everybody was scrambling to get their piece of the new world and get the treasures, and at the same time, during the Western expansion, it was we were in Louisiana Purchase and all these
Yeah.
areas out there where we're you know just as the Europeans were moving in on the Caribbean and decimating the Native American populations, we did the same thing, as we expanded out west. It was, the whole
Right.
European colonization and, move out anybody who's there. It's much to our detriment that this is the way we expand. Instead of absorbing and treating people well, we have to take over and kick them out. And so I
Right.
see things that make me ashamed of colonial expansion, as well as proud of you know the next it's like the next frontier is the space, and it's the
Right.
same motivation to find out what's out there, what's over the next hill and all that. And I think that that the age of sail, and I mean, Escamelling wrote about meeting a alligator for the first time. I mean,
Mm.
can you imagine
Yeah,
a European, you know, coming across this huge lizard, and not knowing what
yeah,
to make of it? You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's a
yeah.
whole new country, for someone in Europe, and all of a sudden they're sweltering and they got all these, like heavy woolen garments, that they came across the
Yeah.
ocean with, and so, it's like the same thing moving out west, they're dealing with a whole different, the Great Plains was nothing like they encountered on the other side of the Mississippi, so it's a whole new thing, and it's lawless too.
And I think another thing you discussed there as well was a lot of these painters that depicted the Wild West. They moved west themselves to properly see like the climate and nature. And
Mhm.
obviously, a huge component of our image of the Wild West, especially in like movies and arts and stuff, is the nature, the climate, the grand vistas.
Hmm.
And you talked about yourself, moving to Florida to get more inspiration for drawing pirates. Um, how so? Obviously, like the nature and the vistas are essential to our image of the Wild West and the cowboy. And would you say that there is like the same sort of connection between our image of the pirate and the Caribbean?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, everybody, has the idea of, sailing to a Caribbean island, and putting your feet up and drinking rum, with a little umbrella in the glass, Um, and we have so many stereotypical um, musings about pirates. And what I found in doing pirate paintings is investigating those and shining a light on them, and having fun with it. I have a pirate, and as we talked about earlier, pirates, as soon as they got gold, they spent it,
Yeah.
but I did a painting of a pirate burying his treasure, which is, pretty much, another iconic idea of pirates, the idea of buried treasure, and very, very, very few of them actually did that, and they did it for other reasons than that. But I decided to have a fastidious pirate, and I call it banking treasure because he's digging in a bank, okay, and the idea of going to a bank with your money, um, and the idea that he has to do it himself because he can't have anybody watching. So I've got these logs where he's rolling the treasure chest over the beach using log rollers to get the heavy treasure over there because he can't lift it, and figuring out he's got a pulley, and to be able to get the treasure there, he had to use a rope and tackle, as he before he buries it, and the idea that he's going to come back for this, and he's going to not tell all his friends, and he's got a musket ready in case anybody finds him, so I'm playing with the stereotype of a pirate bearing treasure, but doing it with some thought behind it instead of just R-ing it, if you will. Um,
And of course, like a lot of these stereotypes that exist about pirates do have, I mean, either a grain of truth or, a whole bag of sand of truth in them,
yeah,
like burying treasure. It's not like they had like the map with the X that marks the spot, but, they did bury treasure on
yeah,
occasion.
yeah.
Same with parrots, they did take and sell parrots. So a lot of stereotypes, a lot of people are negative towards them, even if, they're
Yeah.
true to some
Well,
extent.
walking the plank really didn't actually occur, but they all, I mean, it's part of the pirate lore,
Right.
I mean, if pirate wanted somebody in the water, they just toss them overboard. They didn't want to bother with a plank and making them walk and all that. It was,
Yeah, much quicker,
yeah,
efficient.
yeah, much more efficient. Um, but what I find, Howard Pyle once said, um, you know, dive into your paintings no, he said put your heart into your paintings and dive in after them. So the idea is to really feel what is going on in a painting, and that's where I these pirate festivals have come in really handy for me because I've fired a blunderbuss. I've got a flintlock pistol and fired that. I've got a swivel gun and I understand how to fire that thing. I walked the plank in Key West. I mean, I've hung out with pirates as they did things. We had a pirate hanging at one of these festivals. It's all for fun, but you get into the atmosphere and you can feel it, and you can and these people are wearing very authentic costumes, and so I'm able to really live it in a way that I can bring into my paintings. And that's been very, very helpful as well. I mean, some of these people, literally make their own costumes from scratch. They do leather work, and they make their own felt hats. They design them. They sew their costumes. They literally make their hilts and their swords. I know one guy bought a blunderbuss from a kit and assembled it and put it. I mean, these guys are very, very authentic and do as much historical accuracy as they possibly can. They study the costumes. And I know one guy, after what movie was it? The Cutthroat Island. He found out in Hollywood where they were tossing out the costumes from the movie, and he said, "Oh yeah, yeah, we just got rid of all those costumes." And he goes, "You did?" And he says, "Yeah, they're in the dumpster back in back." They are, and so he's dumpster diving for costumes so he can wear them at
Wow.
his pirate festival. So, we used to have some very authentic pirate festivals in Florida that allowed me to photograph and research people in full costume with the accurate weapons in an environment that was conducive to what it was like in the 16th and 17th centuries.
What is it that you seek to accomplish with your art?
I would like to put an adventure on your walls. Having see something that you don't see every day, or see something that you can recognize that makes you think about being there, being able to put the person into the character. It's like when you read a really good book, you follow that character. You become that character. You empathize with that character in a book. And I try to do the same thing with a painting so that you actually, if you could step into that painting and look around, is what I'd like to achieve with this kind of a thing. And it's not easy to do. I mean, there are two different kinds of artwork. You have two-dimensional artwork, which is art that is on the surface. You have height and width, and all the paint sits on the surface of this. Your decorative arts, your abstract expressionism, like your Jackson Pollock, all the dribbles of paint and all that. It's two-dimensional. It's on the surface. A lot of pop art is like that. There were a few artists that played with that, like Escher, where you can't see if it's on the surface or it's actually going beyond the surface, and Pablo Picasso tried to do some of that with Cubism. But realism makes that surface disappear, and it creates the illusion of three dimensions, so that the surface of the painting becomes a piece of glass, and you can't put your head through that glass, but the impulse is to move your head side to side to see if you can see around the corners of the painting. You want to get involved in that entire environment, and that's what realism tries to achieve. And when you're dealing with realism, there's a time factor. You're freezing a moment in time. You're taking something and stopping it. It's like hitting pause during a movie. Only the artist has spent a lot of time thinking about that moment that he is freezing. So it's in the middle of a gesture, in the middle of an expression. He's trying to find the perfect moment to freeze into a three-dimensional environment that is an illusion. And when I do the paintings like pirates, you're adding another dimension to that, which is your imagination. You don't really know what a pirate looks like. You have to do the research. You got to find out, and you've got to, you know, get all the materials together, and then make that freeze in a moment in time in three dimensions. So, you're building layers of complexity as you're doing this. It's very complicated but satisfying when it is achieved.
So every painting has to tell a story.
Yes.
Do you have like any sort of final message you want to tell to aspiring artists?
Well, my wife, who is an author and an artist, said something that is quite revealing, and that is, when you're doing your heart's desire when the clock stops. And what she means about that is that, I remember being in elementary school, and I would watch the clock. I couldn't wait for that school day to be over. It was like tick, tick, just 5 more minutes of this, and and so I wasn't happy there. Okay, but when I was drawing, it's like, oh, it's dark already, and so I really found out that what I really like doing is timeless. Time doesn't matter. I got, as you say, 10 more minutes and we're done. You know what I mean? It's like, when you're doing something you really enjoy, you don't want to be done in 10 minutes. You want it to last as long as you can to get the full satisfaction out of what you're doing. And so any artist out there, if you're doing something that you really enjoy, and the clock is stopping for you where, time doesn't matter, then you're following something that's important to you, that's making you smile inside. But, if you find yourself, constantly going, I can't wait to get this done. I can't wait to get this done. Then, you may not be doing, your best pursuit. My
Good
my
one.
very best pieces of advice that came to me, and it was like literally the keys to the kingdom, and every artist who has been successful will say the same thing, and that is, or in different words, but the first 1,000 are the hardest. Okay, I mean it's very difficult to begin to draw, and that's why so many people don't do it. But if you just keep at it and fill up sketchbooks and just do it in your free time, your dead moments, I mean, there's so many times when you're actually inactive. Pick up a sketchbook and draw, and just keep doing that, because what you're doing is creating the brain synapses between your hand, your mind, and your eye. And getting that to be smooth will grease the wheels so that you can do when you get done with the 1,000th drawing, painting, creation, it's going to be so much better than the first two, three, or four. I mean, someone said, go out and do plein air paintings. Well, that's wonderful, but what they also said was, and throw away the first 200. Okay, because that's when you start getting good at it. And so many people are too impatient and they won't put the time in to do that. And AI is a killer for getting people to really investigate their true potential.
Now it's gonna 1,000 ones, it's gonna take a lot of time, but
Hmm.
if you're enjoying it, if your heart's in it, then like you said, the clock stops
Hmm.
and time stops being a thing. Anyway, I think that's a really great way to end the interview on. Again, Don Maitz, thank you so much for appearing and sharing your story. I really enjoyed it, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed having a discussion with you, and I really enjoy what you do on your
Thanks
YouTube
so much.
channel.
And that was the interview with Don Maitz. If you want to check out his artwork, including Captain Morgan and other pirates, you can head on over to paravia.com. The site will either lead you to the one dedicated to the books written by his wife, Jenny Wirtz, or the online art gallery of Mr. Maitz. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and found it insightful. I do have more interviews scheduled for release in the coming months, and I have contacted several figures related to the topic of piracy. But if there are any names you'd be curious to see yourself, do not hesitate to tell me in the comment section. Remember to support Gold Gunpowder by liking, leaving a comment and sharing. If you really enjoy the content and have the funds, $1 a month will get you ad-free access to all videos by either becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. Enjoy!